is the Biden stimulus plan going to be big enough to save the economy, the American economy, and maybe pull the whole world out of this COVID recession that we're in? My name is Emil Kalinowski. We're going to ask that question to Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. Jeff, on the 19th of April, you posted at Alhambra Partners an article, and it was called "Neither Keynes, Trump, Pumps, Nor Priming." And the metaphor that we're going to be referencing here is priming the pump, which has to do with the well. And I'm not quite sure, but you know who else wasn't quite sure? Maybe it was Donald Trump, because as you tell us in this article, in May 2017, he invited The Economist, the magazine, to the White House to explain his program to get the economy out of the rut that it was in 2006. Let me just read this. Quote, "It quickly devolved into a war of interpretation between the president and the mainstream media adamantly opposed to him, focused entirely on the words used during the discussion rather than the substance of what had been discussed. President Trump infamously having trouble with words. So let's focus instead on the substance. What was he telling The Economist?"
Well, he was coming out with, if you remember back in 2017, he campaigned on the idea that the unemployment rate was fake. There hadn't been an actual economic recovery, at least not a legitimate one, since the 2008 Great Recession. And it was his job, as he saw it, and what got him elected to the White House, to change all that. And the way he was going to change all that was what he was selling to The Economist in May of 2017, which was his brilliant stimulus plan, which was supposed to have been somehow different from all previous stimulus plans. And in his typical grandiose fashion, he said, I came up with this idea just a couple of days ago and it was great. And most people, after referring to pump priming, most people in the media took that to mean that he was claiming that he came up with the idea of pump priming, And so that was sort of the distraction that went on. And really what he was saying is we got all the stimulus we're going to do, tax reform, corporate tax rates, that kind of thing. And this is going to be really wonderful stuff. That's going to be the thing that breaks the dam and leads to economic recovery so that we can stop looking at the unemployment rate as fake.
Now, priming the pump is actually a phrase that is most closely associated with British romantic John Maynard Keynes, who apparently whispered that sweet nothing into the ear of on some amorous escapade somewhere. Is that what it was? Or what is the idea having to do with that phrase?
Yeah, well, the phrase actually goes back into the 19th century, and Keynes never actually used it. It's been associated with his policies because it most closely matches the idea. And the idea is what in modern economists call hysteresis, which is nothing more than a body at rest needs some force to get it shoved back into motion again. So an economy that's contracting, economy that's in recession, needs some kind of external exogenous force to get it moving back toward recovery again. And that's usually, this is where Keynes comes in, that's usually the role assumed by government, that the government will spend freely during a recession in order to prime the pump to get the economy moving back in the right direction so that it can then take off on its own at a later time. And the idea is, first of all, you're limiting the downside in the contraction and the recession part while also increasing the vibrance and likelihood of the recovery which will follow.
Jeff, I was listening to a podcast recently with David Beckworth, and this podcast is called Macro Musings. It's a good podcast. It's the kind of central banks are central kind of a podcast. And do you know what their last show was about? Hysteresis. The whole show was about that. And they had Antonio Fatas on. So if anyone in our audience wants to get a deep dive on hysteresis, go check out that podcast. But Jeff, is it just another word for recession or secular stagnation or new normal? Is this just another euphemism that David Parkins recently illustrated for us in our previous episode, how he showed, it was from the Seventh Seal, and he showed depression/death playing chess with Biden. And the idea was he had these sand glasses, the time glasses with the sand already run through of all the previous presidents who have already tried to beat him, already tried to beat depression with their stimulus policies. And that's what you say here, is that Obama had already tried this, and I think Bush did too.
Yeah, and that's, I think, really the point here is, was Trump doing anything different? Was it actually something that would break the spell of, as you point out, this lack of economic growth, lack of economic recovery that goes back into the Bush years? And so we've had Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, and each one thinks they're doing something different. But what does everyone else? What does the actual economy do? What is the response to it? And really, hysteresis is it's too fancy of a term, and it really doesn't need to be that. But that's typical economics, which is showing their physics envy here, which is let's make a really simple topic into something more complicated than it needs to be, which is it's really about what role does the government play in recovery, or how does recovery actually manifest itself, or does recovery manifest itself? If the government doesn't do anything, if there's no exogenous shock, or if there's no exogenous positive response to a recession, maybe does the economy never recover? Is that what we're supposed to believe? And it's really no. It's kind of a ridiculous notion, but that is partly of what's associated with the Keynesian version of pump priming, which is that, look, the government needs to step in, do something. Otherwise, if it doesn't, it risks having an illegitimate or lack of full recovery on the other side. And if you believe that, then you think, well, if we haven't had a recovery, then we still have the hysteresis problem, which is the government hasn't pushed hard enough to get the economy moving forward and generate enough momentum so that it can take off from there on its own. Because recovery isn't just some economic growth. It's not just some, a couple quarters of really good GDP. It's sustained economic growth year after year after year after year. And what the Keynesians are saying is that to get to that point, we need to have this boost, this tremendous boost. It's almost like a rocket lifting off from Earth. You have to have a tremendous, massively powerful engine to get this huge weight off the ground and flying upward toward outer space. And that's really kind of the idea here, is that you got to provide this massive force in order to push the economy into its recovery mode. And if it doesn't get to recovery mode, then you didn't push hard enough.
I mentioned David Parkins earlier, our illustrator for the show. And of course, he's moved up to the big leagues illustrating for us, because before he was amateur and he's done numerous covers for The Economist. Yes, that's right. David Parkins has illustrated numerous covers for The Economist, but he didn't illustrate the one that we're going to be discussing, the one that came after their meeting with President Trump, in which they said, wow, they are running hot. And they had a hot rod with Jay Powell and Donald Trump. And it said, America's extraordinary gamble. Let me just set the scene, because it's gonna echo what we're hearing right now about President Biden's stimulus. Let me read just the first paragraph from this, February 23rd, 2018. When should policymakers stop stimulating an economy? America's unemployment rate is 4.1%. At such a low level, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, would normally expect inflation to rise. In 2017, the economy grew by 2.5%, spurred by falls in joblessness that cannot go on forever. And inflation, though still below the Fed target, has overshot forecasts in recent months. All that might suggest that stimulus has become unnecessary, yet America is cutting taxes and raising spending. As a result, in 2018 and 19, it is poised to run an experiment by stimulating economic activity when times are already good. It will find out what happens when the economy runs hot. Well, how did the experiment turn out?
I know, and that's what we're laughing about, is that we've discussed this before, but what we're laughing about is at that very moment that paragraph had been printed, the demise to all that had already been unleashed upon the world. The Eurodollar number 4 had already begun working its way through the system, which eventually wrecked everything there. But I think you're right to point out the parallels here, which is that, look, what they were saying is that when President Trump sat down with the Economist in May 2017, it was still kind of this globally synchronized growth thing was still kind of, we weren't really sure about it. It's coming. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's bad. By early 2018, consensus had it that, look, the global economy is starting to boom again. And here comes President Trump almost unnecessarily adding more fuel to the inflationary fire. He's in danger of doing too much. The economy has reached its potential and is threatening to go above it. So saith the unemployment rate. Therefore, adding this almost unnecessary boost in tax reform and all the rest of the TCJA risked igniting inflationary pressures that would soon spiral out of control, or potentially spiral out of control, which is, as you pointed out, exactly the same parallels to what we're hearing today, that the economy is moving into the right direction. It's reached or nearly reached its potential again, and then we're going to add more government stimulus on top, which is going to, of course, create the inflationary pressures. Yet people make these claims today without ever having stopped and said, well, why did we get it wrong last time? Everything that we say now was said before 3 years ago, and 3 years ago, it sure didn't lead into any of those kinds of things that we've been talking about. And that's really the point here. If we're talking about recovery, what is actually recovery and hysteresis and all of that, and what is the role of stimulus? The idea is, well, maybe we need to define what a recovery actually is. And maybe it's a little bit more than a low unemployment rate, which ironically goes back to President Trump's main campaign thesis, which was the economy's not good because the unemployment rate is fake. And I think his big mistake in those early years was, as soon as he got into office, he suddenly turned around and said, look, the unemployment rate's awesome. So it was bad under Obama, but good under Trump. And that's just, I think from there, he didn't follow through with what his real promise was, which was to be a game changer. Instead, he did this stimulus that sounded different than previous stimulus, but it really wasn't. It was all the same stuff. It wasn't game changing at all. And the results were exactly as you would expect when you realize that's the case. The underlying problems, the underlying lack of recovery, despite the bumper sticker slogan of globally synchronized growth, they didn't mean anything. Despite the unemployment rate, they still had the same major problems behind them, which is, on one thing, stop listening to economists and central bankers.
In episode 46, I read to you the modern version, the most recent version of that economist idea that the economy is running hot. So for anyone that wants to listen to the same story, but now it's Biden's stimulus that's going to overheat the economy and cause inflation, check out episode 46. I guess, Jeff, the question that I want to take away here is, why does stimulus sometimes work, but other times it doesn't? I think if you take a broad look at the post-World War II experience, you would say that it worked. Now, there were exceptions to the rule, though, right? When stimulus could never recover the economy. And I'm thinking of 1970s Russia, 1980s Africa and South America, 1990s Japan. So these are pretty big examples. But I guess this goes back perhaps to Friedman's no permanent shocks assumption. The stimulus does work if we're not in a depression and we can recover from a recession. Go ahead.
You have to define your term. What do we mean by work? That's really I think acquire
past trends of economic growth.
Yeah, and I think that to me, I would object to that characterization, because I think what stimulus does is it correlates with economic growth that's already taken place. So you can make a correlation between it doesn't seem to stop growth that's already taken place. If recovery is already in the process of recovery, then adding more government spending doesn't interrupt recovery, because that's what recovery is. To me, recovery is the natural economic process, which if you get out of the way and let it happen, it usually turns out to be very robust. But you're right. You point out some of these obvious counter examples, like the United States in 2009, for example. Again, stimulus comes in at the end of the Great Recession, and it correlates with the rebound in economic activity, but it did not lead to recovery. And that's an important distinction, because positive GDP is not the same thing as recovering GDP, which is we started here, We went way down here. Now we go back to where we would have been had there been no contraction. The Milton Friedman's plucking model. And that never happened. So when we were trying to evaluate the effectiveness of stimulus from the Keynesians and the government, proponents of government spending and aggregate demand, what they end up saying is, well, it saved jobs. It would have been worse if we hadn't done it. And really, there's, that kind of counterfactual you can't falsify. So it sounds like, well, maybe stimulus did something. But one thing it did not do that is unequivocal is it didn't lead to actual legitimate recovery. We didn't get back to where we should have been had there been no Great Recession. And that really should have stimulated discussion about why. What was really the problem here? Was the problem that we didn't do enough stimulus, as people like Paul Krugman had said in 2008? Is it that governments didn't do enough? Did the Fed not do enough? Did the government need to do a little bit different kinds of stuff and bigger numbers or all that stuff? Or is there something else going on here that is causing what Larry Summers calls secular stagnation, what we call the silent depression? Is there another explanation that doesn't involve stimulus one way or the other? And I think that's really what we're getting to. That's what we got. That's what we were talking about and looking at in 2017 and 2018 was that, look, no matter what President Trump had said, no matter what the Economist had said about the conditions that quote unquote stimulus was being added into, the underlying condition was the same as it had been 10 years earlier. And therefore, this stuff wasn't going to lead to inflation. It wasn't going to lead to sustained accelerating growth. And how do we know that? The bond market told, the global monetary system told us that this was nothing different, that there was really nothing different about it. And so fast forward another 3 years, here we are again with the same basic argument. Is it government spending and the bigger number? Is that really the independent variable that's going to prove how we get out of this underlying structural mess? And the bond market is saying, no, things are better than they were last year. So we had a reflationary sell-off. And really, the reflationary sell-off this year is even less impressive than it had been in 2017 and 2018, which is amazing when you stop and think about it. When the numbers are all much, much bigger now. The inflation hysteria, as I call it, even more hysterical. It's mainstream. It's a done deal as far as most people in the mainstream are concerned. It's going to happen. Inflation is going to get out of control. All this stuff, and yet the market is again telling us it's not stimulus that's the issue here. There's something broken in the system that nobody's talking about, nobody's dealing with, nobody's even attempting to look at.
In episode 32, part 1 is where we discussed Milton Friedman's plucking model, if anyone in the audience wants to learn more about that. Jeff, I want to mention that in 2008, we had stimulus from President Bush as well. Remember the quick tax refunds? So now we're going to have 2 Republican, 2 Democrat presidencies with stimulus, and the results are predictably going to be the same. It's not a political raise taxes, cut taxes, spend more, spend less. It's a wholesale different perspective.
It's bipartisan failure.
Yes.
It's both parties. They both get it wrong time and again. And because they listen to convention, they listen to economists and central bankers. And I'm glad you brought that up because people forget about that. That Bush stimulus was a helicopter. He paid people through tax credits, essentially just for being people, for just being a taxpayer. I'm going to give you, what was it, $300 and $600 for couples. It wasn't as much as it is now, but back then that was a radical idea. Mm-hmm. And the reason people don't remember anything about it is because it was just that effective. It was just that forgettable.
Well, all this quote unquote stimulus is actually raising the debt level quite badly, quite dramatically relative to GDP. And that's what we're going to discuss in part 2.
But first, this from Eurodollar Enterprises. Motion picture event of the summer, Contango Cash. When an international smuggling ring uses the local commodity exchange to send gold into backwardation, 2 macroeconomists take matters into their own hands and onto the spot market. Starring Travis the President Kimmel as Contango. You can take delivery of lead, punk. And Stephen the Monarch Van Metre as Cash. You know how I promised to let you close out that trade? Yeah, man, you did, Cash. You did promise. I lied. With Grant Williams as the polite British guy. Well, chaps, you put the mockers on, didn't you? This motion picture will never be rated, available only on demand at Real Vision.